Hello, everyone. Thanks for attending our webinar, Optimize Your Third-Party Risk Management Program. This will be about a 30-minute webinar with a demonstration, and if time permits, we'll answer a few questions. Please submit any questions you have using the question area on the webinar screen. We will get to as many as we can in time, and for those we aren't able to answer, we will respond to the email address that you registered with. In the attachment section of the webinar screen, you will find a PDF of the slides and any supporting materials that are discussed. I'm Marshall England, Vice President with FortifyData, and I'll be your moderator today. I've been in the cybersecurity and software industries helping educate organizations about cybersecurity and managing cyber risk. Also with us from FortifyData is Eric Smith, who is our Director of Technical Services Delivery. Eric, can you share a bit about your background?
Hello, my name is Eric Smith. I am the Director of Technical Services Delivery for FortifyData. I've been in the IT industry about 30 years, a former IT Director and CISO.
Excellent. Thanks, Eric. So our agenda here, we'll introduce FortifyData and then move on to some recent research on third-party risk management, along with some upcoming legislation and existing compliance drivers. Eric will discuss the evolution in third-party risk management programs, and he'll demonstrate FortifyData's approach and provide a demonstration. For those of you who are not familiar with FortifyData has built a next-gen cybersecurity risk management platform that enables you to identify and manage your risk exposure across your entire attack surface. So this includes external risks, internal risks, cloud configuration risks, and also third-party risks. These can be utilized as individual modules or used all together. Our capabilities empower security stakeholders to accurately present risks through customizable risk modeling, where we enable organizations to create risk models based on priority vendors, as well as configure the weighting of risks associated with specific assets that are discovered. We publish the data as a security rating to help you get a benchmark of your cyber risk exposure with actionable guidance to improve the score. We can help translate your security risk information into quantifiable financial impact insight so you can convey potential loss of imminent cyber threats, return on investment of your security program, and insurance policy coverage. And then finally, we integrate with all these types of existing security technologies that help better inform your risk profile with threat and vulnerability feeds. And since we base our data on live assessments, you will always get the most current and accurate visibility of risks that your organization is exposed to. And so for this webinar, we're focusing on the third-party risk management product. So here are a couple of points related to recent research. Forrester, as part of their 2022 cybersecurity and risk predictions, is predicting that 60% of security incidents will result from third parties. They have data that in 2021, 55% of security professionals reported a breach or incident involving third-party vendors. And further discussed within that report is that technology needs among cybersecurity professionals will grow, requiring tools for risk assessments, supply chain mapping, real-time risk intelligence, and business continuity management. In other research conducted by the consulting firm Deloitte, Deloitte's third-party risk management global survey from 2021 as well found something similar related to the increase in technology needs. Their finding was that investments in risk intelligence is a key priority for those respondents. And their report further described that evolving third-party risk management programs requires an integrated and technology-enabled platform that coordinates activities across an organization and provides a single up-to-date picture rather than inconsistent and out-of-date data from various sources. So we have linked to the publicly available versions of these reports in our attachment section below the webinar window. Here are a couple of legislation items related to third-party and supply chain risk. Last year's White House executive order on improving the nation's cybersecurity, Section 4 of that order specifically addresses enhancing software supply chain security. And keep in mind, this is from the lens of critical software related to the federal government, but we often see industry adopt federal guidance over time. So there are some prescriptive tactics to securing the supply chain within that Section 4 of that executive order that are worth exploring further. Related to third parties, their vulnerability management, and overall cybersecurity. And then for our friends in Europe, there's pending legislation that has come about as a result of the pandemic. This legislation, the Digital Operations Resiliency Act, or DORA, is for the financial services industry and calls for a common set of standards and cybersecurity requirements for improving the maturity of their third-party risk management programs, including the digital communication service providers that they use. And since many organizations and specifically financial institutions, rely on the availability of those technologies to deliver services, digital resilience cannot be underestimated. So the information is also linked in our attachment section below to that legislation. And of course, there are already existing regulatory compliance requirements that are focused on third-party risk management programs. This is just a sampling of some of those regulations and some of the specific criteria, controls, and requirements. Like, for example, like SOC 2 criteria for 9.2, which states, and I'll quote, the entity assesses and manages risks associated with vendors and business partners, right? So they're looking for a control that you have in place to meet that criteria around assessing and managing the risk with vendors. PCI DSS's 12.8 requirement section is about managing, maintaining, and establishing processes with service providers and those with access around the cardholder data environment. And finally, the OCC bulletin from 2013-29 calls out, and I'll quote here that they're looking for plans that outline a bank strategy to identify the inherent risks of the activity and detail how the bank selects, assesses, and oversees a third party, in addition to doing proper due diligence in selecting a third party in the first place. So all this to say, with some of the legislation previously mentioned to the current compliance requirements that exist today, third-party risk definitely has a focus on it. So I'll turn it over to Eric here to discuss how third-party management has evolved and the challenges with it, and then he'll discuss our approach for optimization.
All right. Well, thank you. All right. So some of the biggest challenges you have when trying to assess your third parties are first inaccurate data. Uh, if you can't get good data on what's going on with them, then what's the point of the assessment in the first place? So you need to be able to get comprehensive data that's covering all of the attack surface. And you also need to do a minimization of any kind of false positives and false negatives while at the same time. Additionally, the time and resources. You usually don't have infinite resources of staffing and budget, and it results in a lot of this stuff being overlooked or ignored. You just don't have enough time to spend on these things to give them the attention they deserve. Then there's always the third party resistance. Nobody likes having their dirty laundry shown. They sometimes want to present a better face to you than what they really have, or they just don't have the time to go through the questionnaires with the attention to detail that's required, and it leads to them wanting to just quickly just say yes, 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 yes. I'm compliant on everything all the way down, just to get it off their desk. And then last but not least, there are people who do assessments of third parties and so forth, but they do it very infrequently, like once a year or once every 6 months. That presents a serious problem because, well, if you've just completed an assessment, let's say an annual assessment of someone, and they make a mistake in their config, or a brand new vulnerability comes out, like the most recent Log4j, for example, that happens 24 hours after the assessment. Well, you'll go another 364 days before you know there's a problem. So the lack of continuous monitoring is a big challenge. All right, so for that, let's talk about how we can address some of these problems, and I will get into the demo. All right, so what you're looking at is the dashboard for our third-party risk management module. Now, like many dashboards, this is designed to give you a high-level overview of all of your third parties at one time. We're going to break down all of your third parties into scoring bands so you can see where they're all falling. We're going to plot their performance on a heat map so you can easily identify where everyone is performing in each one of their various categories and so forth. And then down below, we have a customizable tile-based interface where you can add and remove different kinds of tiles and customize the types of metrics that you want to see across all of your third parties, relevant metrics. Like I said, you can add and remove different kinds of tiles. Now, if you have a lot of third parties and you want to get a subset of this information, it's very simple. We provide you a filtering capability where you can filter on a wide variety of criteria. In particular, we also allow you to create an arbitrary number of arbitrary tags that you can apply to any of your third parties. This effectively gives you the ability of building custom filters, so you can filter it however you want. You can tag it on whatever you want. There's no limitations on any of that. But as I said, this is kind of the high level overview of everything. Let's say you need a little bit more detail. Well, for that, you can go to the portfolio view. And here's where you'll get a listing of all of your third parties by name, their vendor classification. Now, this is their risk to you as defined by you, their score. If you've got any kind of questionnaire activity going on with them, it'll show when it's been requested, or if it's in progress, or if it's completed, it will show you their level of compliance to the questionnaire. We can do both point in time and continuous monitoring of any third party. So if we're doing continuous monitoring, you'll get a score graph for them. So you're able to see what their score looks like historically and track whether they're doing better or doing worse and so forth. Now, also, just like on the dashboard, we also have filtering capabilities here, where many of the same criteria I showed you earlier, but This is something that should be of particular interest following something like Log4j. You can actually filter all of your third parties based on threats and vulnerabilities in addition to any other criteria you have. So let's say that you've got a brand new vulnerability that just came out and you want to know immediately, do any of my third parties suffer from that vulnerability? Well, it's very simple. You go and find the particular vulnerability in the list, click on it, builds a filter off of it, and you can immediately filter down and know there's no ambiguity involved here. This list is updated on a daily basis. So if anybody comes along and they've got a brand new vulnerability, you don't have to query them or expect a new assessment or anything like that. You can go and look at it right then and there. But let's say you need even more detail on your third parties. You want to dig deep into what's going on with them. Well, let's go look over here at Tyrell Corporation. Now, for every third party, this is where I can speak a little bit about how our assessment methodologies differ. Um, when you're pulling data on a third party, you really can group the kinds of data you can pull into two broad categories, that being active and passive data. Now, passive data is typically known in the industry as OSINT, or open source intelligence data. It's any kind of data that you can get passively. Usually this data is acquired from things like sinkholes. Sometimes it can be acquired through things like ISP traffic logs if you sign an agreement with them to share that kind of data, and other similar sources. It's kind of akin to tapping a phone line and listening to a conversation. You're able to glean a fair amount of information, but the only thing that you can listen to is whatever conversations you can hear and whatever happens to be discussed on that conversation. If you miss a conversation, or if the critical detail you're looking for isn't discussed on whatever you're listening for, you're not going to find out that information via an OSINT-based analysis. So where we differ from the majority of the industry is, while we do intake a lot of the same OSINT data sources that everyone else does, we don't rely on it exclusively for our assessments. Instead, we also do active assessments. And for that, I mean, for every asset that is detected, for every company that we assess, we do a full attack surface assessment on every single one of those assets. And when I say full, I'm not referring to just a few hundred ports or even a few thousand ports on every asset. I'm referring to every port on every asset. And that allows us to do something a little bit unique. We actually can generate a score on every single asset in addition to the overall third-party score. So you're able to quickly and easily identify any low-performing assets. This lets you do something almost like a meta-analysis, because you can see, well, is their score really being dragged down by one or two really low-performing assets and the rest of them are fairly good hygiene? Or is it a more systemic problem spread across the entire organization? Now, we're also going to be plotting where all their assets are on a map so you can see where they're doing business. We also are capturing threat intel. This is looking at any kind of behavior that could be coming from a particular asset that could lead you to believe that it's already compromised. And if you did have active threat intel, then the dots would be red blinking, and you can hover over them and see exactly what the threat intel would be. In addition to this, we let you see all the vulnerabilities that are currently present on every asset across that entire third party. So you're able to see everything that's ongoing with them currently. You're able to see the finding data when it was originally detected and so forth, so you can get an idea for example, how long that particular vulnerability has been sitting out there. You're able to drill down into the individual vulnerabilities and get more detail on each one of them. And in addition to tracking the current vulnerabilities that a third party has, you can also track everything they have ever fixed since we started monitoring them. So this is something of like a sanity check or work log in tracking all the activity, but it also allows you to analyze what are they actually focusing on versus what they might be ignoring, for example. Now, we spread these vulnerability checks across both infrastructure and application. The application one, the presentation is identical, but its focus is on web applications and not just infrastructure issues. And we also cover addressed vulnerabilities here. So again, you can track what they've been working on. And the advantage here is you get the holistic picture of not just what's currently facing them, but what has been facing them all along. And this data is refreshed on a regular basis. With an OSINT-based analysis, it's the nature of the beast. You're purchasing data from other sources. There's always going to be a lag time associated with intaking that data. But with active assessments, we're actually going out and getting the data on the spot. So there isn't a lag time involved. If you're seeing it, it's because it's there. Likewise, if you're, let's say, corresponding with a vendor and you say, well, we've detected that you've got these following vulnerabilities here. And the vendor says, oh, yeah, you're right. I'm going to go fix that. And then they come back in a little bit and they say, okay, it's been fixed. Well, how do you know it's been fixed? Are you going to take their word for it? Well, actually, with our platform, you don't have to take their word for it. You'll know about it. If it moves off the threat events tab and over to the vulnerabilities address tab, you know it's been fixed. It's that simple. It takes the guesswork out of it. And just like everything I've shown you already with all the data that we gather, it's all searchable, it's all sortable, it's all filterable, and it's all exportable. So if you need to get the data out and do something else with it, you can. We also cover things like patching cadence. Now, this is going to show all the missing patches for this particular third party, but that's not actually the point of the module. What it's actually doing is not just detailing what patches are missing, but how long it's taking the third party to do their patching. Now, this is done both as a point in time analysis and over time analysis. And we've set it up to go with NIST guidelines, which state that you should be patching your critical vulnerabilities within 30 days, your moderates within 60, and your lows within 90. So we're tracking to see if that's actually taking place. Also covering any breach history for the organization. So if they've ever have any publicly disclosed breaches or if there's breach data out there about them, you can know this. This is great for things like due diligence if you're doing mergers and acquisitions, or let's say you've shortlisted a bunch of companies that you're probably going to do business with one of them. And now's a good time to take a look at their cybersecurity hygiene. You can run an assessment on them and see what all their vulnerabilities are and what their patch history has been. Have they had a lot of breaches? Does it look like a company that doesn't take their cybersecurity seriously? Or conversely, do they take it seriously? So you're actually going to have hard data to back that up. We're also going to cover dark web findings. So we're going to show, do they have any credentials of theirs that are out there floating around that could present a problem? For example, this is how Colonial Pipeline got hacked, was because they had actual valid credentials that had been disclosed in a data breach through some third-party company. That person or those credentials were used to go in through the Colonial Pipeline VPN, and then they had inside access, and that's how they did what they did. We'd also surface any dark web credentials that are particular to you. So if they're exposing any of your credentials, we would show that here. And last but not least is the questionnaire module. Now, questionnaires are an integral part of doing business with lots of third parties these days. And the typical way most people do this is they send questionnaires in Excel format back and forth via email. This is not the most ideal way to do things. You send them a questionnaire, they send it back, it's not filled out correctly, or it's got some ambiguous answers, and you send it back again for another pass. And you do that back and forth several times until you finally hopefully arrive at something that's complete. But that's all you've got at that point, a completed spreadsheet. We have turned around and used this process instead, where we take the actual frameworks involved, and we have all the major frameworks: NIST, ISO, PCI, GDPR, you name it. If it's a major framework, we already have it in the platform. And if you happen to need a framework that's not in the platform, it's not a big deal. We can onboard a new framework within a day or two of being asked to put one in, and we keep the ones we have in the platform very much up to date. But what we allow you to do is you can issue any number of questionnaires to any third party at any time. You can have multiple questionnaires in flight at any given time. We allow you to set automatic reassessment frequencies for your questionnaires. So if you've got something that someone needs to complete annually, set it as annual. When their current one expires, they'll be automatically prompted to fill out another one. And if they fall behind, you'll be notified so you know about it. So it takes a lot of the grind work of getting these kinds of questionnaires done out of your hair. Now, as they move through the questionnaire process, we're going to be plotting their progress, I should say, on this little tram map that we have here. But you're able to see overall progress in everything, what they're doing. You're able to look down below and see on a per section basis how much have they completed, what their compliance is on a per section basis, and so forth. But this is where we get even more fun. You're actually able to drill into and look at the answers that they have provided you. You're able to see, is their answer compliant or not compliant with the specific framework? You're able to see if they've changed their answer since the last time you looked at them. And what we also do is something pretty clever here with our questionnaires and our assessments by putting the data together. Now, a lot of these questionnaires, they're asking questions about the cybersecurity infrastructure of the third party. Well, we're assessing that infrastructure, so we know an awful lot about it. In many cases, we know enough to pretty much answer the question for the third party. Now, we're not going to take that extra step and try to replace the human here, but what we have done is we take the relevant findings from the assessment and we've wired them up to the questionnaire. So while the third party is going through and answering the questionnaire, they're going to see any relevant findings that are related to the question. For example, here, this question here for PCI 321, it's effectively asking, do you have controls in place that are restricting connections from the outside so they can't get to anything that's privileged? Now, of course, you want to answer the question yes, because that would make you compliant. But should you? While the third party is answering this, they're going to be presented with their own, what we call our validation assistant data, which is going to show them that, well, wait a minute, before you answer this, you might want to know that the following assets had the following ports open. You are exposing these ports. That's relevant to the question. So you probably want to answer it no. But if you are going to answer it yes, then you should probably provide some form of upload evidence file or supporting documentation to explain why this is an okay thing. Likewise, if you are the first party that is responsible for reviewing the answers that are given to you, you get to see their related findings. So you can sanity check the answers they've given you. And likewise, if they tell you yes and they don't provide any supporting documentation, and you look at the related findings and you say, well, this doesn't match what they told me, and the data doesn't match. Well, you can then engage with them within the platform and say, well, why are these ports open? What's going on here? I need more data. So you can follow up with them. You can even assign tasks to the third party and say for it, the task will remain linked to whatever you linked it to when you create the task. This can be a questionnaire thing. It can be a vulnerability finding, all sorts of stuff like that, where you can put this in and say, I need you to do something. You put in the notes for what it is. You assign a priority of whatever you want it to be. You give them a due date. And then you can assign that task to anyone that you've onboarded from that third party. And that does bring up an interesting point. For every third party that you onboard to the platform, we allow you to onboard whoever you want from that third party into the platform. There's no cost to do this for you or for the third party. We want you to use the platform in a collaborative fashion to work with your vendors to help them get better security, not just give you the insight, give them the insight, but at the same time to help you to work together. But you can assign the task to them. They'll get an email notification that so-and-so from your organization has assigned them a task. It'll have a link in the email that takes them to the task. The task itself remains linked to whatever you linked it to. So there's no ambiguity. It's none of this, well, I don't know what you're talking about. I can't find the relevant results or the question that you're referring to. It's all kept in one place. Once a questionnaire is completed, then it's kept in the platform. It's archived. That data is kept forever. You can go back in there and look at it for auditing purposes. Same thing goes for any of the conversations or tasks associated with it. All this data is kept forever. And with that, that's kind of at the high level what we do. I'd like to open it up for questions at this time.
Thank you, Eric, for the demonstration, and we'll go into the questions. We've got a couple in, so if anybody wants to ask further questions while we're discussing some of these, please do so. We'll get to them as long as time allows. So the first question that came in, Eric, was how does this platform account for new and trending vulnerabilities like the Log4j vulnerability? Can you comment on that?
I was expecting a Log4j to be somewhere near the top of the list. Absolutely, I can respond to that. Obviously, it's near and dear to everybody's hearts because it's such a massive vulnerability. It's probably the biggest vulnerability of the decade. Um, One thing to understand is, first off, Log4j is not the sort of thing that can be found via an OSINT-based analysis. You can't really figure out if you have it based on passive data. There's been some attempts to do so by building vendor lists of people who have announced that they are vulnerable to it. And there's been others that have said, well, we can kind of sort of figure it out through a metadata analysis and so forth. But all that's a poor substitute for the real way to find Log4j, and that is to do an active assessment, which we do on every asset. The key thing here is our platform is in sync with the National Vulnerability Database. Okay, we pull all the new vulnerability data. We do this every 24 hours. So when there's a new CVE identified, we're capable of identifying those vulnerabilities right then and there. The Log4j was announced. We were actively informing our customers the very next day that they had Log4j vulnerabilities. Um, the dashboards updated to reflect the affected third parties of the assets, like I showed you through the threats and vulnerabilities filter. So literally, you find out about Log4j. The first question on your mind is, well, am I vulnerable? Yourself. But the second question on your mind is, okay, which one of my vendors is vulnerable to this? Well, we give you a way to find that information out, and without any ambiguity and quickly.
All right.
Hopefully that answered the question.
Yeah, no, I think that did. Here's another question. Thanks for the presentation. It seems like every vendor provides a score and each score is different. Can you explain your scoring methodology and why it's different?
Okay, let's see. Yeah, well, the first thing about our scoring model is that it is a machine learning algorithm. We have trained it on data from more than 1,000 companies using risk quantification provided by more than 200 CISOs. It's what we call a data neutral model. And the reason we call it that is based on how we do our assessments. If you're doing an OSINT based assessment on someone, you don't get to see all the data. There's going to be gaps. So you necessarily have to bias your scoring algorithm towards what you can see and then kind of minimize what you can't see. We don't have that problem because we're pulling in all the data that can be gathered on every single asset. The other side of it is, of course, the time lag associated with that. OSINT-based analysis are always going to be laggy data. You're always going to be looking at stuff that's old. I've heard, at a minimum, it's a 30-day lag time. In some cases, it can be worse than that. So by going with an active assessment, augmenting that OSINT data, you're actually going to get much more rapid results. The other side of it is, our machine learning algorithm, having been trained on real world data, we would say that it's an accurate representation of what actual risk is. However, we also recognize that there's no such thing as a one size fits all. Different people may want to weigh risk differently. For that, we actually have a risk modeling module. Comes with the product, and it lets you change the score weighting for all the different vectors that we intake. So if you wanted to say, for example, I don't have it right here in front of me, but I believe dark web by default makes up, I think, 17% of the score, or whatever. But if you said, well, in my line of work or my industry vertical, 17% is too much. I don't think 17% is right. We instead need to think it's 10% or 4% or whatever. Okay, then you can change that. And you could say instead, I want to more heavily weight historical data breaches, for example. Okay, it's sliders with percentages and so forth, but you can build your own scoring model this way. And then what you're doing is you're looking at the exact same data, but through a different lens. We let you build as many of these scoring models as you want. They're for internal consumption only, so you get to see the data that it's presented. No one else does. You can use this for reporting and comparison and so forth like that. And you can apply it to any third party that you have. You can apply them to yourself if you're using us for self-evaluation. So it was very, very flexible in that respect. If you want to do scoring differently, you can. You're not tied to our model.
That sounds good. Good way to allow clients to get true representation of the risks. There's another one came in, folks. I know we're coming up on time, but if you want to send in more questions, we'll try and get to them and we'll respond via email if we don't. This one is, how long does it take, or how quickly does your system surface data on a new vendor?
Well, it's the nature of, since we're doing active assessments and getting the data on the spot, that it is a variable. Certain companies will get done faster than others. It's usually based on the size of the company. We typically surface data for smaller businesses with a lower asset footprint within 48 hours of being submitted. Larger companies might take 3 to 5 days, depends. I mean, it's not a hard and fast thing. You could submit a big company that has a smaller number of assets and they'll get done in significantly less time. But yeah, within 5 days, you should have data on practically anybody you could put in the platform.
Sounds good. We got another one came in. This one touched, I think this is addressing a part that you went over in the demo. But one of their concerns is their organization has a volume of questionnaires that they send out, and for them, it's hard to track people down to confirm responses. Does your system augment those questionnaire responses?
Yeah, and I think that the auto validation assistant would probably be a wonderful asset here, simply because you're it's going off the live data. your teams will be able to save a lot of time of chasing down the right answers and making sure everything, because you've got the data right there in front of you. We're doing the comparison for you. We're surfacing the relevant data to the question on the spot. So as far as going back and forth about, well, did they really give me the right answer and all this kind of stuff, you don't have that problem. We're giving you the data you need to know.
Excellent. Here's another one that came in. Somebody is using another security rating provider. Their team spends a lot of time chasing down risk items that they've previously resolved, but the score doesn't change, and the score still identifies that that resolved risk that they addressed is still showing as a risk. How does FortifyData handle this situation?
This is a very common one, and I hear this one very, very frequently. What it comes from is OSINT-based analysis. I mentioned quite earlier. It's always going to have a lag time associated with it. You're looking at old data to begin with, so it may not show things you are vulnerable to already until well after the fact. But it actually hurts you on the reverse as well. You could fix something, and it's not going to show up in that report for that same time lag. We don't have that problem because we're not relying exclusively on OSINT data. We're actually reaching out and getting the data on the spot.
Perfect. And then we got one last one here. Does FortifyData integrate with other vulnerability management products?
Yeah, the answer to that is yes, in a couple of different ways. One, if you want to push or pull data from our platform, we offer a full API. So if you've got another product that you want to either, like I said, push or pull data into our platform or from our platform, you can do that. It's bundled with the product. There's no cost for that. The other side of that is everything you've seen here today is our own product. We don't beg, borrow, or steal anything from anybody else. We've written and maintained everything that you saw. So we have our own in-house development team. We don't outsource any of this. So if you have an integration that you need, we do offer a number of out-of-the-box integrations with common products like Tenable Nessus and Rapid7 CrowdStrike, those types of things. But regardless of whether you've got an out-of-the-box integration available to you or not, if you need an integration with product X, we can do that because we have the developers here to do it with.
All right, sounds good, Eric. That's all the questions I've got now. Again, if we get any that come in afterwards, we will respond via email to the address that you registered with. But thanks again for everybody who made it the full length here for the webinar. I appreciate your attendance today. And Eric, thanks again for your presentation.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, everybody.